My guest for this session is somebody that I'm pretty sure most of you will know, Shashi Verma. Shashi Verma's the CTO of Transport for London, but just to say that is not to describe the man, because anybody who understands what's been going on in transport technology over the last 30 years will know of Shashi's role in, for example, introducing contactless payments system into London, the famous Oyster card, which not only led to pretty much every major city in the world now using contactless payment systems based on the Oyster card, but of course, ironically, led to the point where that card you had, that contactless card, started to be used to pay for other things. And indeed now, every one of us in this audience will have one of those cards on our person, I'll bet, because that's how we pay for everything. We were just saying that if Shashi had actually done that commercially, he'd be richer than Elon Musk. And incidentally, he'd be a much nicer person as well, but that's another matter. So please welcome my guest for this session, Shashi Verma. So from here, sort of interest that I wanted to explore, because I think it's really interesting, is innovation, but innovation in the public sector, not just in the private sector. In a way, you know, many of us who've been involved in ITS businesses bought them, grown them, sold them, grown them, sold them. Fine, the reward is a big check at the end of the day. In the public sector, it just isn't like that. You're there to serve, and nobody's a better example of that than Shashi. But that also means that there are very special sorts of challenges to develop the kind of tech that you need that really moves the game forward if you're in the public sector. I mean, Shashi, this is essentially what you've been challenged with for the last 2 or 3 decades, I know, personally.
Yeah, and it's been an interesting journey for me personally, Steve, but also I think for Transport for London and for the broader transport industry all put together, because this is a technology, well, several of the things that I've done have had an impact not just on TfL and on London, but worldwide, and Oyster and contactless are clearly examples of those. There are many others as well. Contactless, interestingly, has had an impact not just on transport, but on the whole banking industry, the whole world of payments and so on. There's a whole fintech industry that's spending billions on innovation, but this is by far the biggest fintech product that's ever been produced. So it has been personally for me a very interesting and a very intellectually invigorating journey. But there are many reflections that I have after doing this for many, many years, and you touched upon some of that, which is the real question of how does innovation happen in the public sector? Why doesn't more of it happen? And why it's desperately needed. I mean, if you think of it, government expenditure is 40% of GDP. You should expect at least 40% of all innovations coming out from somewhere in the public sector. Very often, the public sector is adopting innovations that are happening by private companies into the public sector. But we should be seeing more of innovation happening in the public sector and more of a spirit of innovation happening in the public sector. But it's not easy. It's not easy. The barriers to that sort of innovation are very real. You touched upon the very basic factor that the motivations are different and the incentive structure doesn't exist. You look at the whole world of startups, many of them are driven by a real desire to do something, but underlying that desire is also the motivation that they're all expecting to become very rich, right? And that's one thing that you will never get in the public sector. So, there is that itself is a very significant barrier. But there are many institutional barriers as well, like the ability to hire who you want, the ability to move fast, without going through long administrative cycles of getting approvals for headcount or budgets or whatever it is. Just the environment is very different, right? But I think it's worth remembering that despite the challenges of that environment, the innovations that come out of the public sector are very significant. Or innovations that are not just coming out of the public sector, but being motivated by the public sector are very significant. And when you think about many things that we use on a day-to-day basis, they have come out of something that has had a very strong public sector incentive behind it. In fact, if you look at in the US, there's this thing called DARPA, Department of Defense Initiative, but it funds a phenomenal amount of technology innovation. Autonomous vehicles actually came out of a DARPA initiative. So there are ways of this happening, but the barriers are very strong.
I mean, that's a really interesting proposition, isn't it? That what DARPA does, because actually as Cubic, I was on the board of Cubic, as you know, for a long time, we did actually take some DARPA money to develop not just in the contactless payment space, but looking more widely at other transport initiatives. Is that maybe what we lack in the UK, or are some of these new initiatives like the British Investment Bank and so on maybe going to... Because the point that you made is you didn't have a group of committed scientists with big pockets because they're backed by people who can see the potential, and in the end they want to make a shed load of money. What you're saying is the gain in the end is a gain for the public, but not necessarily for the developer. So is it that we lack that seed corn funding element, do you think?
Well, I think let's back up a little bit. There's a question of what do we call innovation, right? I think half the challenge is that a lot of things are called innovation when they're not. Continuous improvement is not innovation. I mean, continuous improvement is also important, and I don't take away from the fact that that is the way a lot of progress happens, but that is not innovation. I mean, innovation is something different. In my book, innovation is something where you're either putting a new product in front of your customers, a new product entirely, or a much improved user experience, or you're doing something fundamental to the organization that you're working with, reducing the cost base in a very significant way, or look at the non-tangible, sort of non-financial things that the organization is responsible for. In our case, for example, safety is a very strong non-financial objective that we have. And there are things, in fact, we're working on innovations right now that will improve our safety outcomes, but make no financial difference to TfL. Yeah. And that's also important. Yeah. So I think it's first and foremost, it's very important to figure out what it is that we call innovation. Right? The second thing, and I think it's worth just mentioning this a little bit, so after having done all of this and after having reflected on what it took to build contactless in particular, I took part in a quite big research activity at Harvard. So my friends at Harvard were looking at the US government and saying, what are the conditions under which innovation happens in the public sector? And the research was very instructive in that they said there are 3 reasons why innovation happens. One is a change of administration, where somebody new comes in with the desire to do something different, and actually breaking away from sometimes the morass that the public sector finds itself in, and shedding, just giving it a bit of light can bring about innovation. So that's one critical thing. The second is what they called a national mission, which in the case of the US was defined by the Cold War. And when you look at what the US produced, either the Department of Defense directly or through the industry in the 1950s and 60s, many of those technologies have not been surpassed after 75 years, right? The SR-71 Blackbird flies at 90,000 feet. There is no aircraft that's ever gone higher, right? So there are things of that kind that happened under a very strong national mission. It's also happened in other countries because of non-defense reasons. In South Korea, this kind of national mission to become a developed country has brought about a huge amount of technological innovation. So that's the second reason, which is the country adopting some sort of national mission. Usually it's defense-driven. But what was interesting in what they found is the third reason is that there are mavericks in government. There are people who take it upon themselves to say, I don't like that the way that's being done, and I'm against all opposition, and without much support and without the expectation of a reward, I'm going to do this, right? And I kind of reflect back on my career, I was having fun, to be honest. My main incentive was to have fun, right? I was not one of these people who took the Oyster card and said, nice product, I can have a nice, easy life. My question was, how do we make ourselves better? And in the process, and to be fair, it is possible to build the high-quality teams in the public sector that can help you do these things. It is not easy.
No, it's not easy, and I mean, I think it's a really interesting point to say that changes of government can produce this kind of stimulus, because we've got a new government in this country. Famously, we have a new government in the United States, and of course, one of the most significant people in the US right now is a guy who is probably the most famous innovator of his entire generation, the guy who produced the first EV that you could actually see as a serious car, and then appears astonishingly to have been able to do better than NASA what NASA was set up to do. I don't know about you, but I see that returning rocket slotting itself back in to the launch pad as just being quite phenomenal. So taking my favorite lawnmower expert, Mr. Musk, is he the way forward? I mean, he's clearly very, very rich, but at the same time, what he's doing is advancing mankind. It's said, that Musk was very concerned about climate change, unlike the president, but very concerned about climate change, and the whole idea of building a proper EV car, was actually a response to that. Can we see that sometimes you can maybe match, private capital, private incentive with public benefit? Because he's undoubtedly spawned an entire industry which in December was responsible for 33% of new registrations, EVs.
Well, look, I have no idea what he's up to be honest, right?
I don't think he does
well,
he?
Maybe he doesn't
sometimes?
either. As I said, again, if you go back to the 1950s in the US, a lot of the innovation was spawned by the government but done by the private sector. So that sort of partnership is perfectly fine. I don't think anyone should have a problem with that. Where I have a problem with what Musk is doing right now is that to hack a problem, you first need to understand what the problem is. And I have my doubts about how much he actually understands that. One of the things that, most of the people here have some involvement with government because of the nature of the work that you do. You may work in government or not, but you will have some involvement with government. But if you look at the common conversation that goes on in pubs and bars and dinner tables around the country, government is actually quite opaque, right? It's quite hidden from the public except for the services that you consume, right? It's very interesting that if you talk to people about their experience of local councils, it's very much driven by the age bracket you're in, the income bracket you're in, because you consume a very different service from the council, right? The only common thing that everybody consumes is the council comes and takes your rubbish away. But otherwise, whether it's social care or schools or whatever, it's a very different service. So people don't really understand the entirety of what government does, right? What these guys have come in with is the idea that, there's too much regulation and we're going to cut regulation and it's going to somehow it's going to take a lot of cost out of government. Now, one might make the case that changes to regulation might make the economy work better, but the government doesn't actually spend that much money regulating. When you look at the number of regulators or the expenditure in regulation compared to the total government expenditure, it is tiny, right? What the bulk of government does is deliver services. And if you don't understand that, what is it that you're trying to reform, right? That's my problem with what they're trying to do. Now, my experience is that, and this is my record, right? My experience and my record is that it is possible to make change in government, it is possible to take cost out of government, and it is possible to do it while making services better. That is essentially the journey that I've been on. But to undertake that journey, the first step is to understand what problem you're trying to solve, right? And in the case of contactless, quite bluntly, there's a very simple example of this. My view was nobody wakes up in the morning wanting to buy a ticket, right? We make them buy a ticket, right? It's a completely unnecessary activity that they don't want to engage in, and it costs us money to sell them tickets, right? at the end of the day, what is a ticket? It's a micropayment. Certainly in a mass transit environment, it's a micropayment, right? So let's define the problem differently. You want to travel and I want your money. How can we solve that problem in the simplest possible manner? And that simple thought was the genesis of the idea of contactless, right? But you first need to understand that the activity of collecting money is not a wasteful activity. It's an essential activity, right? You have to understand the many dimensions to it, because remember, one thing in government that's different from the private sector and markedly different from the private sector is we do not get to choose who we serve. We serve everyone, right? Yeah. You can create a product in the private sector and some people buy it, other people don't. It's not your problem. You do not have that choice in the public sector, by and large, right? Yeah. And so when you start looking at edge cases, boundary cases, these are things that end up defining the nature of the solution that you come up with. They make innovation a lot harder. You have to create things that work for everyone. But if you don't understand these simple principles, it is not possible to innovate in government. All you can do is destroy, but you will not leave the space for something new to grow behind it.
Just on that simple basis around the other issue, of course, is to try to ensure that if we were talking about transit payments, the idea is to get as many people onto trains as quickly as you can, as well as them having paid whatever it is you want them to pay. So contactless obviously did a lot of things. It made it a much simpler process, therefore a more efficient process. Actually, as it happens, a more valuable process for TfL in every way. Looking forward, I remember we've been talking about things like removing gates and replacing them with facial recognition systems and so on, just as a way of getting more capacity on the system. Is that something that's still taken seriously? It just seemed there are too many problems around.
Personally, I've never taken it seriously.
No.
And the reason I've not taken it seriously is, again, you have to go back to the core problem you're trying to solve, right? It solves one problem in that you can get people through stations faster, but it destroys other problems. How do you stop fare evasion, right? And when you look at the potential cost of fare evasion from ungated stations, it is immense. So, if you're prepared to lose 10 or 15% of your revenue, which in our case is close to £1 billion, then fine, that's an innovation that's worth having. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work even at the level of basic principles. And that's why we've not pursued it.
I rather agree. I mean, we did some trialing on, facial recognition, and it's a very imperfect science. I suppose if we did get to the point where it was a perfect science, you might be able to, minimize fare evasion. But at the moment, it's just not. It's just not on the science.
Steve, my take on having done this for many years is that you need to understand at both some depth, but also the level of clarity of principles, what you actually run, right? What is it that what service do you need to run? You then need to have the imagination to think how it could be done differently. And you need to have the tenacity to go from here to there. I mean, remember, coming up with ideas is not by itself the solution. Figuring out a way to hack your problem step by step to get from A to B is also a very difficult problem. Now, I'll share with you sometime, talking about electric vehicles. I had figured out not just that the electric vehicles were the future, but I had figured out a way to build them and run them as a 13-year-old child. And I wrote about it. I still have the paper from when I was 13, right? Now, I was in an ecosystem where that sort of idea could not be nurtured. But this was conceived in 1984. So there you go.
Yeah, it happens. Tell me, what's the next big area to be of interest to the public sector in terms of how they can improve service to the citizen? Is it more technology? Is it more engagement that might come with issues around privacy, which people are obviously very concerned about? Is it literally just getting people to places faster, quicker, safer? Where do you think the next big innovations are going to come from in your space generally?
So there are two ways of answering that question. One is, if you look at the world of transport, what needs to come next? And then I'll come back to the question of what needs to happen more broadly in government. Now, in the world of transport, the first thing I'd say is that all this beautiful technology that we've built in London, that's been live in London for over a decade, is still not available outside the M25, by and large. There are bits and pieces where, in Manchester, the Metrolink now accepts contactless, but by and large, the system still works with technology that is 30, 40 years old, right? And the user experience, there is a real watershed in the user experience the moment you cross the M25, right? So there's one big thing is diffusion of technology, and there are institutional barriers, especially a fragmentation, that's stopping that kind of diffusion from happening. So I think that's one thing that needs to be addressed, because you don't always need to invent things. Adopting things can often get you very far on the outcomes. The second thing that I'd say is, go back again to the basic principles about what is innovation. We're either trying to do something better for customers, or we're trying to do something better for the organization, mainly in cost, but also in other things. And there's a lot of innovation that the public may not see directly, but that improves cost and quality of the service. Automated signaling, for example, is one of those things where it's really difficult, but it's a damn sight cheaper than building a new railway.
I was told that this is, I'm sure most people listening are familiar with this, but the old moving block, the old fixed block signalling system, been around since the development of the railway, still basically being used on huge sections of our railway. Moving block gives you, I remember the figures were, you get 40% more capacity out of your existing railway if you can just use a moving block signalling system than you would get if you were to try and build additional track. And we know that's almost impossible in planning terms anyway. And yet we haven't done a great deal over the last decade or so. That's, in other words, under governments of both complexions, to actually, sort of bring forward something that seems blindingly obvious in terms of innovation. Moving block signaling, simple as that. It's not happening. Now, is that technology or is interoperability?
It's all of those things. It's technology. Look, these problems are difficult problems. I don't want to make light of them, right? They're difficult problems, but that is where people need to stand up and do something challenging. So, you have to go and look at what your cost base is, what the biggest challenges for the organization are, and those are the problems worth hacking. There's no point hacking problems that are inconsequential. You have to go after where the real money is. But if you look more broadly in government, I would suggest, there are many challenges in government. We are searching for a growth strategy after 15 years of not very much growth in the country. The challenges that this government faces in trying to get the country back on the growth path, they're not easy. But there are parts of government that are now stuck in a morass, which sort of made sense when these ideas were conceived. Particularly if you look at the world of regulation, we have a whole system of regulation across industries. I'm not talking about rail alone, but whether you talk of rail or energy or water or financial services or whatever, there's a set of regulatory structure that was conceived largely around the late 80s, early 90s. That's when most of it came about, right? And it solved the basic problem of how to take industries that have been nationalized for 40 years into the private sector. Right? Most people here may not have heard the name. Stephen Littlechild was a professor at Oxford who conceived most of this, right? Starting with the energy industry, and then his experience got taken into other industries. That model is finished. It's run its course. The shortcomings of that model are very visible. But trying to conceive a new model that can take its place is where innovation needs to come in. And the reason I make this point is that innovation is not about technology alone. Innovation is about outcomes. And sometimes it's about technology, sometimes it's about administrative change or policy change. It could be anything. In fact, many of the innovations that I have worked on have had nothing to do with technology. The way we, the story, Steve, the way we put together Crossrail, going from an idea into something that could be funded, something that could be built, using business rates to fund 60% of the project, using sort of completely sort of new economics around agglomeration to really figure out what this project was there to do. All of this is innovation, right? And when you look at Crossrail, the real, so I have two concerns about it. One is all that innovation had never been done before and has not been done since, which is a real travesty. And where people have tried to do it, they've very often mangled what was being done on Crossrail.
It's interesting because there is one example of where we used tax incremental financing. It's a very well-known technique in the US, and that was used to justify the extension of the Northern Line into the Battersea Power Station, which isn't just for the power station, it's for about 20,000 homes that are built around the power station in that whole area of South London. Now that's interesting because it worked incredibly successfully. The government, who effectively guaranteed the cash, has had its money back already, and the line's only been open about 2.5 years. It wasn't a huge investment either. It was about $1 billion, and in governmental terms, $1 billion's not a lot of money. But interesting, you're right about that, because it hasn't been used as widely as it obviously could.
So again, the tax increment financing is one of the ideas I was looking at in 2003.
Yeah.
So that's what I conceived for the Northern Line.
In the US.
It started in the US.
Yeah.
And again, so this goes back to a point I was making earlier. You need to understand what problem you're trying to solve, right? The problem with the Northern Line extension was very clear. There was development potential. How could we use the future development value to fund infrastructure today?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a few minutes left, so I want to give anybody in the audience a chance to just ask a question of Shashi. I think this is a fascinating area because it's all about really where our futures for all of us who are in this kind of industry are going to come from. Lady there, yeah.
Hi, Leon Kong from Greater Anglia. I just wanted to pick up on your reference to the rail industry. You mentioned, I think, signaling blocks. That was a great example. It strikes me that we are at the cusp of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity in the form of Great British Railways, upcoming inception to truly kind of rip things up and revolutionize innovation in the railway. Not, again, picking up on your point, not just technology, but also we have so many analog processes in controls. Control centers are still run based on people phoning each other, post-it notes. But it seems disappointing that the government and the people behind GBR seem to be regarding this as perhaps a bit of a footnote at best, at worst, not even talking about it. Yeah. What advice would you give to someone either in the rail industry, in the policy-making space, or a politician? How would you go about approaching this problem?
Look, if you look at TfL...
We've only got about 5 minutes, and
sure.
That's probably an hour-long question, actually. Brilliant.
I mean, if you look at the example of TfL, which is, I think, instructive here, there were a clear set of objectives with which TfL was set up, right? Building oyster and contactless was not part of those objectives, right? They were a consequence of those objectives, right? The objective was to integrate transport, to make transport better, and so on. The space that those objectives create is what really matters. So whether GBR gets created with the objective of sorting out these analog controllers or not is not material. What I want is ambition. If it gets set up with ambition and the money to go and pursue those ambitions, it will create the space for this kind of innovation, hopefully. It's not guaranteed. Very often fails. I mean, there are many other conditions that need to be successful for this kind of success to happen. But the first thing is, it cannot be just a reshuffling of the deck chairs. There has to be real ambition and vision behind what it is that we're trying to do with quite a big change of this kind, as you say, once in a lifetime sort of change.
Tell me just, if I might, because I think there's one area that we perhaps overlooked, and we will take another question, and that's AI.
Yeah.
I mean, if 30 years ago the sort of potential of AI had been available, who knows what innovations might have emerged or not. But just on that specific point about GBR, personally I think just changing the names changes nothing. I've been involved in so many changes, privatization, nationalization, still all about just getting passengers from A to B. But looking at specifically the new opportunity, what do you think AI can offer our industry in terms of moving forward?
I think AI is already offering some things. and we'll have more to offer as time comes in, right? But I don't want to get caught up in the hype around AI. The fact is, when you look at the technological change that's happened in the last 40 years, what has become possible as a result of it, and the way it's been explored, it has already been transformational, right? If there's another wave of that with AI, well, bring it on, right? But every technology goes through a hype cycle, and AI is definitely in that, about how it's going to transform everything. And maybe it will, but these things are hard. These things are not, this is not like, ChatGPT is going to write you a moving block signaling system, right? They're hard problems to solve. They take time to solve, but they can be solved. And the point about AI is that we should use everything that's at our disposal, every tool in the toolkit, to which now a new tool has been added called AI.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah. Last question. There.
Thank you. My name's Gareth James. I'm from Portsmouth City Council. Just wondering, in London, the fact that the integrated payment system is so well sort of developed and so well integrated across transport modes now, all contactless, does that mean that the kind of business case and the need for a mobility as a service style app solution in London just isn't there in the way that we're trying to build in some other regions?
Well, in my view, we've got mobility as a service running in London. We've got it running for the last 15, 20 years. There's integrated payments, there's integrated information. I just don't, and there's a very simple fare structure where you pay for what you use and you get capped at the right amounts and all that. Mobility as a service, in my view, at least from the way I see it in London, is a solution looking for a problem rather than a problem looking for a solution.
If I could just say this literally as the last word on exactly that, one of the things that Shashi did, which was one of the bravest but in the best, but also one of the most far-sighted, was to make all of the tech available to any developer who wanted to produce an app to help individuals plan their journeys, go wherever, rather than putting their arms round the tech. He said, no, it's there to be used. It's there to improve every journey. And I think, to be honest with you, having run, the been in the Department of Transport for many years myself, Paul, you've got your own challenges, and there's technology available which can help you, and frankly other systems which would not be necessary and would be expensive and would get in the way of offering value for money to your journeys. And I think we're talking about one of the great cities of the world in London. It obviously has particular challenges, also particular opportunities. And I think that's where, in a way, there's the kernel of real innovation in the public sector. Well, can I just say, ladies and gentlemen, it's not, I think this is one of the most extraordinary half hours that we've had today at Interchange, which itself has been absolutely magic. Please give a big hand to Shashi Verma. Thank you. Brilliant, brilliant.